Hey Siri, read me my unread emails.
Prince Asif sent you an email about life-changing opportunity, if you please. It says, I have a once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunity for the making of many millions of currency. Would you like to reply?
Yeah.
Okay, what would you like the email to say?
Sign me up.
Okay, Bill, here's your email message to Prince Asif.
Thank you, Siri.
Well, good morning, church, and welcome. My name is Kenny. I'm one of the pastors, and I'm glad that you're here as we continue our legacy series. I wonder how many of us have had the Prince Asif moment in our life, right? You got the email. Maybe you're too ashamed to admit that you did something about it, right? Oh, come on, people. I ain't buying that. This is a scam for a reason. So when I was in 8th grade, it was the first time that I'd ever experienced something like it. I love technology. And so in 8th grade, when I was in 8th grade, they came out with this thing called the portable DVD player. They still sell them today, but they're like $100 compared to then it was like $500 almost 20 years ago, however old I am. And so they had this portable DVD player. So you could put a DVD in, right? And it was the first time in history where you could take a DVD without a $2,000 laptop and go watch a DVD in the middle of the woods. Like, who doesn't want to do that? So it was the greatest moment of my life. So I went and I bought one of these DVD players. I waited tables and washed dishes and did all this stuff. So I got this DVD player. Well, I've always had a knack for selling things before the prices plunged, right? And so, which is a good knack to have. So I bought this DVD player. I needed to sell it. And I'd always sold it to the people in my neighborhood. And so this time, you can't just, if you sell it for too much and mess them over, or whatever that word you're not supposed to say in churches, right? You go through and do that, then you end up getting a parent calling the house saying, oh, your son sold this to that. I got that call a lot. So I decided to go outside of my neighborhood with this new thing called eBay. In the early 2000s, eBay was on the rise, and I could expand my market to the entire world and sell my portable DVD player, maybe even for more than I paid for it. And so I listed my portable DVD player. It wasn't 24 hours later that I got my first email, because this was important. I was about to get a car, and so I had to have one of those DVD players that was in your car, like a CD-DVD combo in the car that had a screen that came out. Anybody else ever have those? Okay, cool, just me. So I had this DVD player, I sold it, got it, right? I get the email. It's from Prince Asif of Nigeria, a Nigerian prince. Well, in this day and age, who else has the money to pay full price for a DVD player other than a prince from Nigeria? This is a great idea. And so he begins the process of telling me how we can get this transaction completed, but he wants to do it all offline, all off of eBay. And I think, well, that's wise, because then I can save 10%. I get even more money. This is even better. And so I begin to package it up. He wants me to mail all of this stuff to Nigeria, where he lives, and he will mail me a check. And so I package all of my stuff up. I go to the United States Postal Service and pay a fortune to put this thing in the mail and send it to Nigeria on like 2-day shipping so that I can get my check. 20 years later, still waiting. Never got a check. Have you ever made a poor financial decision? Right? I mean, just something that you're like, God, that was dumb. Why did I do that? You don't want to tell your friends or family or kids or coworkers or parents about it, right? Maybe you bet it all and it didn't work out, or you ruined your credit, or maybe in kind of a worst case scenario, you bankrupted your family, or maybe you're still paying off the debt that you incurred because of that poor decision, or maybe today you're sitting in the seat, maybe you're Monahans or Andrews or here in Odessa or watching online, and you are literally holding it all together with like a string. It wouldn't take much to bust everything apart, and the worst part is nobody knows. You're the only one that has any idea of the financial constraint that you're currently just barely surviving in. Know what your kids don't know, maybe your spouse doesn't even know, and you're just trying to keep it all together. You're delaying the inevitable, hoping for a miracle. A legacy is about passing on what matters most. That's what this series has been about, and today we're going to look at our financial legacy. And passing on what matters most means we can only pass on what we have. You can't pass on what you don't have. Choices matter. They inform your family and your peers, the people around you, as to what really matters. So what is your financial legacy? What is your financial legacy? What are you leaving to your family? And I'm not talking about the bank account balance when you die. I'm not talking about the transfer that was made earlier on in your life so that you could get a jump on spending your inheritance, right? It's not about a dollar. It's about a legacy. And there's two kinds of legacies we're going to look at today, because I just don't believe it's all about money. I just don't believe your financial legacy is all about money. I think it's so much broader, so much larger than that, and so much more important than that. Here's what I know. That according to the USA Today, 78% of you are living paycheck to paycheck. 78% of this country lives paycheck to paycheck. The average American household makes about $50,000 a year and saves less than $100 a month. I know that most people have this elusive thing in their mind. If I could just get a six-figure salary, everything would be okay, right? You know some of those people. Maybe you were those people at some point in your life. 60% of people who have six-figure salaries are living paycheck to paycheck, just like the rest of us. I know that if we took a survey in this room, 75 or so percent of you would say that you have what you would call an unmanageable amount of debt. How did we get here? How do we get here as an organization, as an individual, as a family, as a country? How did we get here? Why is this so normal? I mean, why is living paycheck to paycheck in debt that we consider to be unmanageable with too little savings in the richest country in the world? How did we get here? Here's what I believe. I believe it's peer pressure. I believe it's keeping up with the Joneses, and I don't mean Griff. That's his last name, if you didn't know, our lead pastor. Right? I believe our culture defines a certain lifestyle, a certain standard of living, and if we can't afford it, it's normative, it's normal to borrow against it. It's a cultural norm. How do we get here? It's a cultural norm. A cultural norm is just something that's normal in culture, right? I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, but a cultural norm. We live a cultural norm. If we don't have this lifestyle, if each of my kids don't have their own room, if they don't have their own bed, if they don't have their own toys, whatever, if each of my kids don't have their own car, whatever, you pick the norm in your lifestyle that costs you money, right? If we don't eat out every Sunday at lunch, and that's what's so crazy. You know what those stats mean? That means today, this is nuts. Today, somewhere in the neighborhood of half of you are going to go to lunch. You're going to put that lunch on a credit card. 30 days from now, you're going to get your credit card bill. You won't be able to pay it, and the lunch you put today will sit and earn interest and become quite a bit more expensive than you intended. Isn't that nuts? And it's normal. And we think oh, well, here we are. This is just, right? Like my mom used to say, if everybody else jumped off a bridge, would you do it? Like, well, if there's water at the bridge and they're jumping, it looks fun. Yeah, I would. Bad example, right? But that's how we think about money. Well, everyone else is where I am, so it must be okay, right? We're all going the same direction. It has to work out okay. Can I tell you it doesn't? It didn't work out okay. A cultural norm in Nazi Germany was to kill Jews, right? It was normal to be in the military and kill Jews and kill Russians, right? That's normal back then. That's not a cultural norm that turned out okay, right? Think about 1787, when the Constitutional Convention, America had won its independence from Britain, right? And the House of Representatives, if you don't know, is constructed by the population of your state. And so people in the South had slaves. They wanted them to count within the population so they could have more representatives in the House of Representatives. But they didn't want to count them full people. So they came with what's called the Three-Fifths Compromise, meaning every African American in America in 1787 was decided to be worth 3/5 of a person. Our founding fathers who followed Jesus and are Christians, that's what they determined was a cultural norm in that day. That's not normal. That's not okay. Cultural norms have gotten us in trouble throughout history, and until we accept the reality of where we are, we're going to continue down this path of complete and utter destruction. Can I tell you, it's just mind-blowing how cultural norms have defined our lives. You think about the Egyptians. They built these giant pyramids as graves, as memorials for their god, which was their pharaoh. That didn't work out for them either. Cultural norms can be good things, but they can be very dangerous. Church, our financial legacy isn't the amount of money left in the bank when we die. We don't get to pass on our good things when our life is a financial disaster, right? Our financial legacy is what we've taught our kids. It's how we've instructed our neighbors, our friends, the people around us through our choices. We laugh at that story of the Nigerian prince, or some of you laughed at my dumb story of the Nigerian prince. But some of us place our financial hope in things that are just as silly. So why? Why should we listen to a church perspective on money? Can I offer you this? Because today, we're not going to talk a message. This isn't a money message intended to raise money for the church. That's not what we're here to do. I'm going to offer you some thoughts on tithing because it's in the Bible at the very end. So you can listen without risk that I'm not going to turn it at some point and say, you need to give all your money to the church, okay? But here's what you need to know, a church perspective on money. You need, if you're a follower of Christ, if you're a Christian, this is why it's important. Because God invented money. He invented what you have. Not only he invented, he owns it. And not only does he own it, but if you're a follower of Christ, it's your responsibility to live out your financial position the way that God has intended for you to. And let's just be honest. What you're doing is not working anyway. So why don't try something new? I want to offer you some thoughts from 1 Timothy because God offers some pretty clear thoughts and directives on how we handle money. And if we look at things differently, if we choose to accept reality instead of cultural norms, we can choose to live a financial legacy that matters. So what does God have to say? Well, I want to give you some thoughts that are going to sound crazy. They're counterintuitive, but I believe it's the solution to getting out of debt. Dave Ramsey offers some great practical solutions, but unless you change the heart, it doesn't matter. Unless you change the motive, it really doesn't matter. You can apply all these great practical steps and principles, but until you change the why behind the what of what you're doing, it really doesn't matter what practical things you apply to your life. So it all starts with accepting reality. Are you ready? Reality. The reality is that you're rich. Can you let that sink in? You're rich. Well, you're right. I've got great kids. You know, my wife is fantastic, or my husband works hard. Yeah, you're right. I am rich, and I should count those blessings. No. I'm talking straight financial wealth. You're rich. If you earn $33,000 a year as a family, you're in the top 1% wage earners in the world. Church, our minimum wage earns more than half the world. Way more than half the world. 1%. 33,000. If you earn $80,000 a year, you're in the top 0.1% wage earners in the world. We live in one of the wealthiest areas in the country. Our country averages about $50,000 a year in income. Families do. Here in the Permian Basin, it's about $88,000 a year. Let me give you just a practical example. Here we go. Now, I'm not a magician, but I've been working on this, all right? You ready? Now, these are dollar bills. George, who signed that 3/5 compromise, I just trashed him a minute ago, but he's still valuable because he's on our money, right? So, also, he did a lot of great things. But, all right, you ready for this? $2, two $1 bills. If you're online, I'm sorry, you won't be able to probably see this workout. Ready? You ready? It's like the girliest throw of all time. I really want to try that again, but they'll stab me if I jump off that thing. Did y'all see that, though? Anybody, if you're watching online, I want you to know no one moved. No one is, for 50% of the world, that represents feeding your family for a month. That's a day's wages. I throw that down in many parts of the world, and they bum rush the stage because it represents an opportunity to feed their family. Church, we're rich. We're rich. Until we accept that reality, we're not going to make a change that matters and live generously. One of our core values at Crossroads. We're rich. God has blessed me with more than I need. Therefore, I'm rich. Now, we don't think of ourselves as rich people, and so a lot of times we read this passage in 1 Timothy and we kind of skip over it. And we say, well, I'm not rich, but with our newfound perspective, we are rich. I want to read you what Paul writes to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6. He says, command those who are rich. Guess what? That's you. He says, and me. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain. But put your hope in God, who richly provides for us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. What do we do if we're rich? It's lined out right here. Don't be arrogant. Don't put your hope in wealth. Put your hope in God. Understand money is for your enjoyment, but do good with it. Do good deeds, be generous, and be willing to share. How do you live a financial legacy? It starts with the reality that you're rich. So what does it mean for me? Well, let's look a few verses earlier. Paul was writing to Timothy in chapter 6, and he gave us an interesting perspective, and so I want to share that perspective. But before we do, I want to tell you a little bit about it. So Paul is the author who wrote this. Paul encountered Jesus. His name was Saul, rose to Damascus, bright light. He's blind, somehow like scales show up on his eyes. He can't see, right? And he changes his life and follows God, becomes the author of many of the books in the New Testament. And then as the Bible instructs, he begins to mentor some guys who become pastors, Timothy and Titus specifically. And so Timothy is one of these pastors, and Timothy is pastoring in a place called Ephesus. It's a city that still exists on the Mediterranean today. So Timothy is pastoring a church called Ephesus. Paul started this church, and he's trying to help him, give him information, to give him support along the way as he leads this church. And Timothy would listen so well to Paul's mentorship and teaching. He would preach the gospel until he was 80 years old when they would stone him. At 80. Nuts, right? It's pretty crazy. So Paul writes these words to him, and this is what he says. He says, "But godliness with contentment is great gain." If you don't listen to any other passage of Scripture, if you choose just one thing to hear today, this is the solution to your financial problems. Godliness with contentment is great gain. Well, you're thinking, what does that mean? We're going to unpack that as we go forward. But the summary of it is that contentment is what we lack when greed is in the front, right? When I want more, when I want to sell my DVD player for more, so I put it on eBay. Now, there's wise financial decisions, right? It's not about making poor decisions because you don't want to be perceived as greedy. It's about the heart. I can tell you, at that age, I wanted to sell that thing for the most amount of money that I could so that I would have the most amount of money to go forward and buy more. It was about greed. It wasn't about just making a good financial decision. And so I wasn't content. He said, godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, we can take nothing out of it. Can I tell you, I must have been 16 years old before I realized that my mom telling me, I brought you into this world, I can take you out, was not like a true statement. Like I really thought she was allowed to take me out of the world. I thought that was legal. Apparently, it's not. You get in a lot of trouble for that. Thanks, Mom, lies, right? But welcome to my counseling session. But that's not what God's saying. He's not saying, I'm going to take you out of the world. He says, for we brought nothing into the world. You didn't have anything when you started with it, and you can't take any of it with you, which was counterintuitive to those Egyptians building those pyramids, stocking it with all that stuff, right? That's what they would put in the bottom of the pyramids, all the stuff for them to live their afterlife with. He says, but if we have food and clothing, and that Greek word for clothing also includes shelter. So he says, if we have food and clothing, shelter, a place to live, food to eat, we will be content with that. What I love about this verse, the way Paul writes it, he says, we will. He's saying, if you're a follower of Christ, this is how you're going to do it. He's not offering a suggestion for how you live your life financially. He's saying, if you're a follower of Christ, this is how we do it. There's like a period, an explanation point. This is it. Contentment just means to be content. Means we're focused on life regardless of the external circumstances. It's not about what's out there. It's about what's in here. Let me summarize this verse in 2 statements. Your stuff is irrelevant and greed is irrational. But greed is what permeates most of our financial decisions. It's what drives us. We don't want to admit it because greed is a bad word. We want to say we're savvy or we're collectors or hoarders or whatever you want to put it on the term, right? But greed is irrational, especially when you put it up next to contentment. But it's the root of the issue, and it's the root of most of our financial issues. We want more. It's all about more, more, more. Greed is irrational, and so is the state of most people's finances. They are the way they are in large part because of greed, wanting what others have. Greed is the primary source of debt. But greed is irrational next to contentment. So what's the solution? How do I get out of debt? This isn't on your handout, but I want you to write it down. Generosity diminishes greed. Generosity diminishes greed. When we choose to be generous, it will diminish the greed in our life. Let's keep looking at verse 9. It says, those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. That's just a great line, plunging people into ruin and destruction. So he's saying, if you want to get rich, the desire to get rich often is the thing that pushes us into a trap. Let me tell you. So I mean, it's almost like it's a trap when to walk home and my wife to say, "Hey, correct me if I'm wrong," but like you don't correct her. So you didn't laugh. So I'm really concerned about some of your marriages. Really very, very worried. We're going to start a series next week on marriage. I'm just kidding. We're not. We're in legacy. But let me give you a better picture. This is the best picture. My brother-in-law, he taught me. I was young. My sister is about 10 years older than I am, and so they got married when I was still kind of a kid, young teenager, early teenager, something like that. And he was the first person in my life that was really passionate about the outdoors. So he took us on one of my first fishing trips. And so we went to the lake, and he taught us, the rod and the reel and casting the hook thing out, and I learned a lot, into the water. I'm just kidding. Casting out into the water, right? And putting the bait on the hook and the whole bit, right? And then you kind of draw it back in until you get a bite. Well, one of the first times I did it, I got a bite on my hook. And so I'm really excited. I can watch my rod just goes down, right? I'm like, oh, I got to pull this on. Pulling it in, right? And I finally get it, and it's this catfish that was, at least this big, right? I mean, right? It's a good fishing story. It has to be that big. But as I'm looking at it, here's what I'm thinking about. As I'm considering what's happening, I didn't realize until that moment that this is how fishing worked. You put a hook in the water, and then somehow a fish is dumb enough to bite it. Like it sees something on the hook and it bites it, and then it gets pulled into the direction that it doesn't want to go and ends up out of the water where it can't survive until someone may or may not choose to throw it back. And I thought about that in light of our finances, right? Many times we take a bite of something, we have no idea. It's going to draw us and pull us until we go where we don't want to go, and we get into so much trouble we can't get out. And then some of us, some fish, you know what they're dumb enough to do once they get thrown back? They bite the hook a second time. You talk about fishermen, you talk about hook holes. Look at all these hook holes. I caught this same guy 3 times. They throw him back, and they catch him again. Don't we do that with our finances? Don't we do that when we approach generosity? We just do it over and over, and we expect a different result, which happens to be the definition of generosity. We fall into this trap of getting rich. We all know the people who have been in the pyramid scheme, right? If you just join, it's going to change our life. And after like the 8th time they've asked you, you're like, listen, bro, I'm not biting the hook anymore. Stop biting the hook. It's a trap. Verse 10, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Now, here's the thing about this verse, and there's several verses. One day we're going to do a series, maybe, I don't know if they allow me to sit around here long enough, but I'd love to teach a series on all the misinterpreted verses in the Bible. Like there are people say stuff and what's not in the Bible. Let's just talk about that. Like the number of things people say to me that are not in the Bible. What goes around comes around. God says. No, God doesn't say that. He never said that. Right? I could give you a list, or God can do all things through Christ. Really, you're going to win the Super Bowl? That's what you think that Paul was talking about, the Super Bowl. Anyway, but this is one of those verses, because we talk about money being evil. Money is not evil. There is nothing evil about money. What's evil is the love of money, not money itself. Money is neutral. There's nothing wrong with money. Money's fine. There's nothing wrong with pursuing money. If you're rich, you're not living in sin as a result of your wealth. Congratulations, because every one of you is rich. The love of money is the root of evil. Not even just the root of evil, right? All kinds, not every evil. You hear people talk about how money causes all the problems in the world. No, money doesn't. It's the love of money. It's the desire to get rich that causes all kinds of evil, and not even every evil. But the love of money, and really the love of anything other than God, can push us towards all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith, pierced themselves from many griefs. Wealth and the desire for rich can drive us right away from God. Money's like a gateway drug. If you don't handle it properly, it takes you places you don't want to go. The love of money, not money itself, is evil. Plato says it this way. He says, excess in anything causes the opposite reaction. They realized this early on, even before, as the Bible was being written. Secular philosophers understood that too much of anything is a bad thing, right? And our church fathers, they were famous for framing it this way, that moderation in all things is how you should live your life, that anything in excess is poison. So you're going to leave a legacy. Everyone does. You're going to leave a legacy with the resources that God's given you. No matter how much you have or how little you have, how wealthy you are, you're going to leave a legacy. So what kind of legacy is it going to be? I believe there's 2 options. You can be generous or you can be greedy. Those are the 2 options. Those are the things you're teaching your kids. Remember, generosity diminishes greed. I was reading this week about David in the Old Testament. David, the guy who slayed Goliath. Right, he had a son named Solomon. Solomon was the wisest man in the world. He also had 800 wives. you can be wise and not live out your wisdom, right? It's okay to laugh at that. Yeah. So, but why did Solomon have 800 wives? I just kept thinking, he's the wisest man in the world. Well, where did Solomon get this idea? Well, his dad, David. David was the first king to really break the mold and have multiple wives. He had 8 wives. So his son had 800 wives. What's the principle for you and I? What you're doing today is going to be copied exponentially by the people who are watching. Whether that's your kids, your siblings, your parents if you're leading up, your coworkers, people working for you. The choices that you make matter. Your legacy matters. So what is the legacy of the greedy? It starts with this. The greedy never have enough. Ecclesiastes tells us that whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. It's what we love that drives us. There's a lot of research in this area. One of the craziest things that I read this week about this was that people love people get happier with more money. That's one of these things that we believe, if I have more money, I'll be happier, right? But Pew Research did a survey that indicated countries and their wealth, and about 50 countries or so participated. But the United States, the wealthiest country, was kind of out all the way on the right side of the wealth side of the spectrum, right, with $53,000 in our economy for every person. Not that every person makes that, but that's what exists in our economy. And so you have $53,000, right? But our happiness level was like 6.9 on a scale of 1 to 10. These people in these countries filled out their happiness level. So then you had, on the other side, other countries that were way happier. Somebody like, there was a Middle Eastern country, I think it was Israel, or Mediterranean country, they had, their happiness was like 75 or 7.5 or 8, something like that, really high with like $40,000 in income. You have Mexico with like $15,000 in income, and they were way higher and more happy than us as Americans are. What does it tell us? The survey tells us that money doesn't make you happy. After a certain point, money doesn't help you anymore. It's about you. The Harvard Business Review does these long studies, and they studied this group of people. I've told you some of you this before, maybe in a class or a financial peace class, but you have, they studied these people who made $25,000 a year when they were just getting out of school and starting out. What is it that would make you feel like you just were on top of the world financially? If I could earn $50,000. Down the road, these people are earning $50,000. What would make you feel like you were on top of the world financially? $75,000. What would make you feel like you're earning 75, you're on top of the world, $100,000, and so on? It's a moving target. What's enough? There's never enough, because the legacy of the greedy is that we never have enough. And remember, this is the cultural norm that we live in. So never having enough is the start to the legacy of the greedy. The second thing is that we find it hard to give big. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. Remember that trap for the rich. They find it hard to give big, to give in a way that makes an impact. In 2 Corinthians, Paul says it this way: in the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. I testify they gave us as much as they were able, even beyond their ability. Paul's talking to the church at Corinth about giving a gift to the church at Jerusalem, not money that Paul was going to get, even see, or even touch. He was encouraging them to give big to another church that was in need, because it was about being generous. The legacy of the greedy finds it hard to do that. And the final thing is have money in the bank but no peace in their hearts. Better a little with the fear of the Lord than great wealth with turmoil. The legacy of the greedy is what prevails in our culture today and many people live with. But what does it look like to be generous? And what are characteristics of people who leave a legacy that is going to be generous? I believe they give strategically. They give in places where they know they can make a difference. 2 Corinthians says, each of you should give what you have decided in your hearts to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. It says give in a way that makes a difference. Give to places that make a difference. Investigate where you're giving. Have a conversation with the people that you're giving the money to do something with, whatever it is. Give strategically. Don't just throw it out there. Give strategically. Make an impact with the dollars that God's given you. That means maybe you write a will and you put things in your will that you want to be funded upon your death. It means you're auto-drafting your giving. Maybe if you're a member or a regular, this is your church, and you're giving here and you're tithing here, maybe you auto-draft your tithe. It means seeking out needs above and beyond what God has instructed us to give, but giving generously. I had a friend who told me this week, who started a business and it's begun to do well. He says, I want to give big now, because when I make money, down the road, it's going to be harder to give it away. What insight from somebody in their 30s. There's a man in our church, and he's been in our church for a long time, and he's very generous. He tithes and gives to the church. And he had a conversation. He wanted to begin giving more, but he wasn't sure how to do that. And so we're talking, and he's telling me this, and I was like, what do you want to give more to? And he wanted to meet the needs of people. And he said, don't you guys have a lot of people who come to the church and ask for stuff? And I said, sure, there's always people in need and people we know about, people within the church and outside in the community, you see stuff. And he said, well, I want to know about the needs. And so there's this one particular need that we were able to tell him about that just radically transformed a person's life. This young lady, this young girl had been diagnosed with a disease that she worked really hard to become healthy enough to get a medical monitor to be able to control the disease so that as a teenager sitting in school, she didn't have to get up every 15 minutes or every hour and a half or whatever it was and go get a shot. She was able to have this pump right on her that could take care of it there, and she could learn and focus. But she had a mom, of course, with 3 kids that was a single mom, and she couldn't afford this pump that was several $1,000s. So this guy, out of his generosity, decided he wanted to anonymously, I had to ask his permission to even tell this story, but anonymously meet this need because he just wanted to be generous and give it away. Church, that's being strategic with our giving. It's making an impact, making a difference. It's giving to ministries that are making a difference. Not just throwing our money at places to check a box. That's not what tithing is about if you're a skeptic of the church. It's not about funding the church. We want to fund the church, but we want to fund the church because we believe in what we're doing, not because we just want to fund the church to check a box. So not just strategically, but also sacrificially. Sacrificially. This is a great story you may be familiar with. Jesus looked up in Luke. He saw a rich person putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put her 2 very small copper coins. Truly I tell you, he said, this poor widow has put more than all the others. The story represents sacrifice. All she had were these 2 coins that were pretty much worthless. But she gave them anyway, because she wanted to give sacrificially. For me, it's less about how much I give and more about the percentage of what I give away. So every year, Melissa, my wife, and I, we sit down and have a conversation. What are we going to give? The conversation is, what are we going to give away this year? It's not a dollar amount, it's a percentage, because God can change whatever I make, whatever I earn, right? I mean, that's true for all of us, right? I can lose my job tomorrow, so can you. Or I may lose an income source, a business, or whatever it is, right? I can lose all of that. But I'm going to commit to God that I'm going to give away this percentage this year. And every year we try to change that percentage and increase it so that we can give away. Because I can give away $1 million, but what good is it if it never makes an impact, if it never makes a difference, if it never changes me? You want to know the solution to getting out of debt? I told you it's a little crazy. Give away more money. Pretty counterintuitive, I realize. But give away more money. Why are you in debt? Most people are in debt because they want more. So learn to give away, and then you won't want more. You know what? No one has ever walked in my office to tell me, I'm having a really hard time feeding my kids this week because I gave all my money away. No one has ever said, I have $50,000 in credit card debt because I just keep tithing. I just keep giving to the Red Cross. I can't stop swiping away. No one has ever said that to me. People don't give their way into debt. We get into debt because of greed. So I challenge you. Give it away. Try it for a while. Give it a couple of months. Give it away. See if it doesn't change your heart, change your perspective. Teach your kids this. If you get a new toy for your kid, ask them to pick one to give away, whatever, right? Find a process in your life to teach generosity and build a legacy of the generous. What kind of financial legacy are you going to leave? Generosity is the solution to this greed problem because generosity diminishes greed. So I kind of botched how I explained it at the first service, so let me do a better job for you today. But here's what we want to do. I did this 10 years ago, and somebody prompted me recently the impact that I made in their life. And so I passed it by Griff. He's in Monahans today, and he knows I'm going to tell you this, all right? So you don't have to text him and tell him, yeah, you're not going to believe what Kenny just said, right? Though you're probably going to do that anyway. But so here's what I'm going to do. If this isn't your church, if you're a guest with us today, this doesn't relate to you, all right? If you've just been marginal and just visiting for a little bit, that's great. This doesn't relate to you. If this is your church, if you're a member, regular attender at Crossroads, whether you're online in Monahans or Andrews, here's what I want to offer you to think about and process. I want to challenge you because the person that called me this week told me it changed their life when I shared this in a message 10 years ago. They said, I want you to consider tithing for 90 days. I want you from here to the end of the year, October, November, December, 90 days. Malachi chapter 3, verse 16 says that if we give, that God will pour out the blessing. He says, test me in this. There's a lot of commands that God gives. And people want to argue with me about the tithe. That's my favorite argument. It's my favorite argument. Well, the tithe is an Old Testament principle. Okay, that's cool. You know what the New Testament principle is? Jesus says, give it all. So people are like, oh yeah, no, the tithe is great. Where do I sign? Where the tithe? 10%? Oh, that's generous. God is really good. Man, ooh, love the tithe. All of a sudden, you make lovers of the tithe. So I want you to challenge you. A tithe is a tenth, is 10%, right? I want to challenge you to tithe for the next 90 days because I believe God will open the floodgates of heaven on your life. I don't know how he's going to do it. I want to challenge you to do that. And if you choose to do that in a way that we can track as a church, if you choose to do that here, and you do that in a way that we can track, whether you give in cash and put an envelope with your name on it, or you use a credit card or whatever, you choose to do that in a way we can track, and God doesn't bless your life, I'll give it all back to you. That's because I can claim the promises of God. I know that God will bless your life. I know the solution to the greed that lives in every one of our hearts, and now you do too. So what are you going to do with it? How are you going to live your life to leave a legacy for those coming behind you that makes a difference? Finally, many of us, maybe you're far from Christ. We need to accept the strategic, the sacrificial nature of the generosity that Jesus offered when he gave his life on a cross. Because without that, none of the rest of this matters, and no change is going to be permanent in your life. Would you pray with me? God, thanks for today. Thanks for your word and your truth. Thanks for allowing us to live in a country where we're rich. But God, we know that comes with great responsibility, as your word outlined and we just read. So help us to be responsible with that. Help us to give and be generous, to leave a legacy of generosity in a way that matters. If you're prompting us to take a step to tithe for the next 90 days, I pray that you would give us the courage to take that step. If you're prompting us to give whatever away, that give us the courage to be obedient, that we could be generous, that it would transform who we are, that we don't live a life of greed as maybe our cultural norm. For those who are here and are far from you, that have never accepted the strategic sacrifice that your son made on a cross. God, all of this talk of money and generosity and legacy, none of that matters if we don't first have a relationship with you. So I pray that if you're prompting someone here to make that decision to follow you, that you would give them the courage. Come and talk to one of our pastors. Find me after a service and let us pray to enter into a relationship with Christ. Father, we're grateful for what you've given us. We're thankful. And we ask all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.